And now we're going to give Andy Hemmings his opportunity to show what he holds in his hand. Yeah. Andy will be presenting on post-glacial to modern fauna of the Northeast Texas coastal plain region. And I turn the mic over to Andy.
We need help getting it.
Oh, yeah, sorry. My talk will largely focus on archaeologists' biased view of using sites that are terminal Pleistocene archaeological sites with a lot of these animals present in this area of Texas, mostly because I want to make sure we have a reasonable expectation that those animals, if they weren't directly predated on by human beings, they're at least present when we know that human beings are not only on the landscape, but at these specific loci. So this is just a cover sheet, sort of a nod to David Webb, who's come up a number of times, who retired with his wife Barbara to Montana. It's an old beer label from the glacial times. So I have a number of sites that really indicate a couple of things that are kind of interesting, both referring to what Bruce and Ralph had said about immigrants, that this portion of Texas, the coastal section of Texas, in many respects is a big crossroads, literally and figuratively. And I'm actually going to use I-10 and I-35 as an example repeatedly for some very good reasons, not least of which is that that they really have physiographic and geologic reasons that they've become important. First off, just in general sense, Florida is not quite 25% the area of Texas. So it's a massive area that has hundreds of millions of years of vertebrate paleontological life to deal with. And really we're focusing on, Galveston Bay, and I'm going to use some examples between Galveston and the Louisiana border, because there's not a lot of terminal Pleistocene fauna in that part of Florida. And frankly, I shouldn't be the one giving the speech. The two best scholars for it, Art Harris at the University of Texas, El Paso, and at UT in Austin, is Ernie Lundelius. And they were both invited. Art turns 91 this year, and Ernie turns 95, and they don't travel, and you got me. So looking at a general geologic view of Texas, the greenish light line running north-south basically parallels the I-35 corridor, which you see shown from the I-35 Wikipedia page in the bottom right. And the reason is, what you're looking at geologically is the boundary between when Pangaea broke into Gondwana land and the other one whose name I always forget. Those pieces rotated around and came back together. And when they made contact, that's what that green line is. And when they tried to put I-35 in, they had to do a lot of drilling. They discovered massive cave systems and basically proved a point that people prehistorically had known forever, is that where the Texas Hill Country and the Llano Estacado, all the rock and upland area to the west, not mountains, somebody said that earlier, but hill country, where that intersects the Blackland Prairie and the coastal plain, all the rivers that run through it basically provide nice stone, nice, very compartmentalized little microhabitats that are, confined in these drainages that have water, and some of them have water all of the time, which is a really big deal on a dry Texas plain. So you can see how extensive the Blackland Prairie. I don't think anyone up around Dallas would like to know, or they would contest it severely. I'm sure Bruce will throw something at me if I say that it's coastal plain up there. It's not, but it's part of the Blackland Prairie physiological province. And running along from where the parallel black line you see next to Galt, down south of there, there's another half dozen sites around Austin, down to San Antonio, and out west of San Antonio. I'm using data from about 10 sites along there, and really all I'm trying to do is establish that within this Blackland Prairie and Gulf Coastal Plain, a lot of these mega herbivores and a host of other strange things, including many that go extinct, are present and roaming about on this landscape when we have people there as well. And I'm going to contrast that a little bit with McFadden Beach, which is our best coastal sample of terminal Pleistocene fauna, and then I'll end with a tale of 3 kitties. This is a nice aerial view of the Galt site, and it gives an example of just, you see the undulating terrain, incised, slightly incised, not terribly bad, but creek bed. That pond has been expanded historically, but that creek in the last, in the last 140 years or so has never gone dry in historic times. And this is one of those very rare sites, very much like Wakulla, that from pre-Clovis to historic now, every occupation of humans that we know that could be in the area is actually present. There's even a Spanish church with a cross on the top of it drawn on a rock wall at Galt. There's a number of species present in the Clovis and pre-Clovis occupations, and at Galt, I use this because it's a particularly nice example of these animals were most certainly there. Galt has 4 Clovis layers separated 2 at the top, 2 at the bottom in a meter 10, and then another meter plus of pre-Clovis deposits below that. Unfortunately, the preservation of bone is typically not very good. This is a pretty standard view of the small mammals from Galt. Mercifully, it's not always that bad, and a number of the things that you would expect on that landscape are, of course, there. Mammoth, bison, horses, a lot of other smaller things. Not a huge species list considering how massive the site is, but really a preservational issue more than anything else. This is a nice juvenile mammoth mandible that was found, and the one bone tool that was recovered from the Clovis layers. It's in really rough shape, but there's a few good photos of it, and not a lot to go on. But again, this is one of the 10 sites along this list. We're going to move for a minute to Wilson Leonard. To Horn Rock Shelter, which is on the northern end of things, not far from Waco. And literally, I'm running us up and down I-35. One of the things that's important here, big surprise, there's a lot of aquatic species. Catfish turns up at some of these sites, gar, lots of turtles, and other, a host of the small mammals as well that are more aquatically oriented. At Horn Rock Shelter, there's a particularly interesting, roughly 10,000-year-old burial of a man and a child that included a rattle made from a turtle shell, and the man had on his face what appears to be a mask of a turtle. So that not just are these things present, but a good degree of interaction is also pretty well known. Bruce touched on alligators, and I think maybe somebody else has mentioned them once before. Up near Dallas, they're present at Louisville, which is a problematic archaeological site, but it's of the right age and Pleistocene to be of interest to us here. Kincaid Rock Shelter is not an area where you'd think of a lot of water. It's about 125 miles west of San Antonio. And for North America, you get out of those couple of sites along that I-35 corridor and the handful of sites where alligator is present in the Pleistocene here in Florida that are on my slide. And that's it for the continent. And we're starting to approach some of the things I want to talk about with the sort of barriers represented by I-10 and I-35, and we'll come to that in a little bit. I was going to talk about some animals first, though. There's 3 kinds of giant ground sloths across North America, mainly found here in Florida, and then a good number in Texas. Megalonyx jeffersoni, not to scale, unfortunately. I just wanted to fill the space, and I thought it was a great image that just floats there of the skeleton. The gentleman from, I think he's Argentinian paleontologist, he has a wonderful site where he either compares himself or Volkswagens to every Pleistocene animal, and you can't help but use some of his images. Actually, this is the largest land mammal on the terminal Pleistocene landscape. It's only present at Vero as an archaeological site, but this is one of those animals that its closest relatives are in South America. Same with Paramylodon is the third one that's here in the Oscilla, and that's what's on display downstairs from a couple of different sites, including Page Ladson and Sloth Hole. Paramylodon and Eremotherium don't show up in the Texas area we have under consideration. But they had to have gone through there, maybe they're earlier and died out early, because they got to Florida, which isn't too big of a reach for them. But some of the other things, like I think Bruce and I are using the same image of the Glyptodont, again, present up near Dallas, and then at a handful of sites. And again, I'm particularly slicing this, 13 to 15,000 year old range to put people on the landscape at the same time as these animals. Down at Vero, we finally were able to directly date one scoot from the back of the giant armadillo, Homzina, and there's its closest genetic living relative, but it's an interesting counterpoint to an animal that's here across Texas, all the way over to Florida, that vanishes. And after that time, and mostly in the last 100 years or so, the range expansion of armadillos is into Texas. In 1900, armadillos were almost unheard of in Texas. They just didn't see them. It was as exotic to them as it would have been to us here in Florida in 1900. And this is essentially, it pains me to say it knowing how much they dig up, but this is a story of success in otherwise a series of talks about extinctions. We have some successes, and I'm going to end with a couple of really good examples of those that are really kind of surprising, I think. But this is a reversal of trend that we're seeing now in the Holocene and in obviously the recent and modern era. Across the southern portion of the United States, particularly Texas and Florida and the area, and of course throughout the area where we're talking, we have mammoth and the Columbian mammoth. I'm sorry, mastodon and Columbian mammoth dominate the proboscidean samples. There are, from the oscilla, one fragment of a gomphothere that Bruce and I have been talking about. We're going to try and get something together and see if we can date this, in part because from the oscilla one piece of gomphothere, maybe 20 other occurrences that are considered to be Rancho Librean or end Pleistocene in Florida, and now, of course, the El Fundamundo gomphothere kill site in Sonora, Mexico. So the other end of I-10 going the other direction, but we have firmly now an understanding that that animal is on the terminal Pleistocene landscape with people. And is that the case here in Florida? We don't know, but I think Bruce and I are going to work on that now. So more to be told on that story. And of course, what the things I refer to here in terms of how many individuals, how many numbers of specimens, and what were the people doing with them, and more things that we need to examine about their life history. But as giant animals that roam a long ways, they're not as sensitive in terms of environmental indicators or local adaptation. They just kind of modify their habitat how they see fit. Bison's not unlike that story with the giant bison roaming all over the place. We see them in Texas through time, waxing and waning almost in concert, and I have a slide to show this in a little bit here, almost in sync with, I shouldn't say almost in sync, it's very close, it's pretty much in sync with the rainfall, and that means is a translation for the availability of grass. And bison, of course, are here in the Pleistocene, disappear, come back in Bartram's time, and then are gone again. So it's a success story that has some head scratching to do. The genetic story going on in our understanding of the Pleistocene equids, I defer to Bruce entirely on this because I know we've got kind of zebra-looking things around here now. How that relates to what morphologically were called convergensis and Franci and all the other Scotti, the other terminal Pleistocene horses is unclear, but they most certainly roamed up and down Texas as every bit as successful as the bison had been throughout the Pleistocene and their arrival. We get into a little bit stranger situation here now where we have Camelops hesternus, a nice live view of one there, and a skeletal view on the left, is present at Kincaid Rock Shelter and to sites farther west, and then it doesn't pick up again until you get around the mid-Atlantic states, out of the Carolinas, where Ralph might see them up there, but they are never present in Florida. The antelopes are a similar kind of thing. They're even in the Pleistocene, they're present. We found them at the terminal Pleistocene site of Louisville, and then they're present at some of the early sites in Wyoming, but just not here. They do not make it to Florida, and they don't make it very far into Texas. They're restricted, certainly in the end Pleistocene, in that different environment. It was not something that they liked. Conversely, the Hemiakinia and the Paleolama, the stout and stilt-legged llamas from Florida that are going back and forth with South America, are not in Texas either. And I really expected to see them at McFadden Beach or along the coast. and they're not there, and it's a really strange bit of the story there as well. Some of the carnivores have been touched on already. The coyote in the middle waxes and wanes, does a pretty good job of range expansion in the 20th century when, in the absence of a lot of the other predators that had been there prior, like certainly the Pleistocene examples of the Smilodon in the upper left, the American lion, the Tremarctos, the spectacled bear, and some of the others, the dire wolf, of course. Again, all of these, I'm not sure about how much American lion. There's a couple occurrences farther west in Texas, but Smilodon and Canis dirus show up along the I-35 corridor sites all the way out to McFadden Beach as well. Get into a real fun animal here now. The tapir, viroensis, is one of my favorites because of the work down there. And a real interesting part of the development of the story of where do these animals come from and what are these Pleistocene non-analogous associated sites like. Sellards dug it in Vero in the 19-teens, and they kind of had a handle on that it's a fairly aquatic, loving, tree-dwelling animal, or a forested canopy kind of animal. When Emil Houry dug Ventana Cave out 100 miles west of Tucson in the late 1940s, he went looking around trying to find a comparative faunule to see what he was seeing in a very dry, rocky, barren part of Arizona, and they had tapir. And so his comparison was the best thing he could find as a regional or reasonable proxy for it was the fauna at Vero. And you just don't think of Arizona being like that, and certainly you see tapirs making the trek up and down through Texas along now land area, and also, of course, what Dave Webb characterized as part of his expansion of the notion of the Great American Biotic Interchange. Dave really added like the most recent end of that chapter to that in expanding our understanding of what was going on there. And one of his suggestions, in addition, I'm not sure that tapir per se was part of that, but I'll finish the tapir and move to my map in a moment here. But like I said, tapir is present out in Arizona at a Pleistocene archaeological site, then at Levy Rock Shelter, and a couple of others on our I-35 corridor sites. That what's kind of interesting here, I derailed myself thinking about tapirs again. All I really want to say is that the east-west movement is what becomes interesting from, say, central Texas. And it's almost ridiculously coincidental and silly, but the fact that I-10 and I-35 intersect in San Antonio is essentially the border of this area, and it's an intersection that in some respects forces things that if they don't want to get into colder climes have to go basically headed towards Florida. One of the interesting aspects about this, and this is the part that Dave added that's really important to our talk here, and especially as I move to inundated portions of the coast now, is that he called it the Gulf Coast Savannah Corridor, and that basically the white part of the map off of Texas, or the area in the green below Houston, that there's a band on the continental shelf that really appears to have been a bit of a highway, and that's being traversed by animals from essentially, as soon as the Bering, boy, our land bridge is always the Bering. It's never Panama. We don't think about the 4 or 5 million year old. The land bridge from Panama opens up, and you start seeing animals moving across that. And in the full Pleistocene Ice Age cycles, that there's opportunities for that coastal bridge or coastal area to be open, and it's clear that there's a host of animals coming and going with varying degrees of success, immigrating to South America or coming from South America into North America. One of the fun stories, I don't know why I did that, on Dontrosabithicus, the colder loving muskrat, is present in North Texas today. This is a modern distribution map. It's retreated out of Florida and retreated away from half a dozen of the sites in Texas that had it present at the time. It is, from their standpoint, they're still extant. They still live in the area shown here, but they've most certainly moved off of the area that's of interest to us here in coastal Texas right now. A good example a little farther south that I wanted to just mention in passing passing is the Hoyo Negro site in the Yucatan that has a very interesting and very diverse Pleistocene fauna with a very, very tropical signature to it, but it's also probably the closest gomphotheres at this time period that I could come up with an example of. But again, we have them in Yucatan, over in Sonora, right below Arizona, and all the way up to here in Florida. And really in Florida is where we just don't know exactly when they were on that landscape. The column on the brown segmented column on the far side is the presence of bison. The white areas represent their absence, and you can see they're really quite in sync with the wet, dry periods. When it's very dry, they disappear. When the dryness starts to improve, it doesn't have to be fully wet yet, but if it's improving, the bison seem to come back. That's good enough for them for a while. And these waxing and wanings through time, I mean, bison's a big, obvious mammal, and there's a lot of work that can be done with all of these species in terms of figuring out those kinds of cycles, presence and absence, as we build bigger databases and have more interesting things to, the ability to ask interesting more questions. We should be able to fill in a lot of those kind of questions across taxa and get a better understanding at an ecological level rather than just individual species. So here's a quick view. You see where we are in Texas. Just we're basically adjacent or near the Gulf of Houston is just off our the white map in the corner here down to the left. You can see it maybe better above the M or so in McFadden Beach over there, and shows the area across across the Gulf. I'm not sure. Unfortunately, I clipped a little bit of it here. Across the bottom, you can see the area of collection. We say McFadden Beach as though it meant one thing, but it's actually 20 miles wide, and it's not really clear what is going on there. Why is there so much material? And I'm talking about hundreds of Paleo-Indian points, a lot of Clovis stuff. This is just a view from about 1990 of just looking down the beach and seeing what it looks like. Very flat area, but keep in mind, of course, that in the Pleistocene, you drop the sea level hundreds of feet. We're high and dry here, and it's an upland kind of area. The artifacts seem to be washing in on shore. They don't seem to be eroding in place here, that the site is out there on that continental shelf. It's out part of the area that Webb would have characterized as the Gulf Coast Savannah Corridor. There's been a conference there with a book that came out by a guy named Russell Long. There's been a dissertation by Melanie Streit that focused on the site, but there's a lot of really unanswered questions. And along with all the artifacts, I show a picture of Mike Collins with Dennis Stanford, and also that's Long on the right, who organized the thing, and a famous point that he found that looks like it came out of the Oscilla. On the upper left, an archaeologist friend of mine and Jim's named Tom Label from Illinois was there on a family vacation and sent me the text of that picture. He found a Clovis base next to a pickle jar while he was just walking around. The fauna there is pretty beat up, and unfortunately, because it's washing in, we don't really have the control that we have at the 10 sites on the I-35 corridor. Is that it's a bit of a palimpsest, and we don't know how much time is actually represented. Is it 13 to 15? Is it the last 30,000 years? It's not clear, so that's why I wanted to use the other sites to establish that all the other animals and the things that are found here at McFadden Beach are in fact, we already know they're on that landscape, we just don't know what time they're specifically at this portion of that landscape. So here's a couple of interesting views showing, I think it's the 15,000 year and then the 10,000 year inundation as slowly but surely sea level is rising. Here are the last mid-Holocene up to modern, and a relatively recent update. Oh, and it just cut it off. Doggone it. Update of new fauna that's added to the site about in 2010 in an article by a named Ken Brown. And it included something that was really exciting to me because, and we're going to go to those in just a moment. I have, I think, 4 slides left, is the jaguar. The jaguar is present at McFadden Beach right at the end of the Pleistocene, and it's really quite a rare South American taxa that did make it into North America but at the time, or certainly it was still here when people arrived, but a number of other, the sort of usual suspects, many of which I mentioned from the other sites. But that South American connection and what shows up in Texas, and obviously the things we're interested in is derivatives that end up finally making it over here to Florida, includes some very, very strange things every now and then. And this is one that Ernie Lundalis and a number of other folks published in the Journal of Vertebrate Paleontology in 2013. It is the one and only occurrence of a toxodon. This one's Mixotoxodon, in Harris County, so right in Houston, dating to about 16,000 years old. And this is where it gets particularly interesting, is that an animal that wasn't even known to have ever arrived in North America, let alone the United States, is now just young enough. This last and only occurrence of it at, say, 16,000 years old is getting awful close to some of our more controversial pre-Clovis sites. Did human beings in America ever see this animal? It went from, in 2010, that was a resounding no to, I don't know, maybe. And that's really kind of the beauty of doing this stuff, is the longer we keep at it, however good we are right now, this is the dumbest we'll ever be, that the data set is always going to grow and we're always going to know a little bit more. I don't know if you guys noticed, I was carrying around a plastic cat earlier. It's a terrible Halloween mock-up for a roughly 1 kilogram cat called a margay. Its relative that Peter so kindly asked about, here in the Oscilla, it's known from the Pleistocene of 2 archaeological sites, Sloth Hole and Page-Ladson. It's also been found at about 10 other older or non-archaeological paleontological sites in the Ichtuckney and the Santa Fe. And then it has a surviving relative that's very closely related in Panama. We talk about mammoths, mastodons, and all these other things making the trek across the continent. If your legs were that long, do you want to walk from Panama? How did that get here? This one, and I'm ending with 3 quick cat stories. We don't have that in Texas. It's not known there, but it had to have been there. Either it's along the Gulf Coastal Savannah corridor or inland through the area of, it had to go across the area around Galveston Bay. It's just, you can see why they're harder to find than mastodons. One of the other things is one of my favorites. In '99, there was an article in Science about another extinct Pleistocene animal in North America. And very few people ever think about it, and I love bringing it up whenever I can, because the mountain lion is in North America, within the study area of where I'm talking about. It's only present at 5 archaeological sites in North America in the Pleistocene, but it is present at Levy and Horn Rock Shelter, so just north side of Austin and just outside of Waco, Texas. But again, within the Blackland Prairie physiological province. They are completely extinct by 10,000 years ago. Studying the genetics of every, I think it was 150 specimens of mountain lions that this research group could find, from some Lewis and Clark stuff to everything across the continent of North America. They tested the genetics of that mountain lion, and all of them were related to one clade, and it was the northernmost clade in South America. There's 6 different groups of genetic variation. The northernmost one is where they all came back from. So a Holocene success story out of a Pleistocene failure on that landscape. And there's another one unfolding in real time now that's really pretty interesting, and one we don't really think about at all. There are 2, because Ken Brown's article about McFadden Beach doubled the known distribution of Pleistocene jaguar in North America. It's at Vero Beach and it's at McFadden Beach. So either jaguars really like beaches, or we've just been lucky. And what the map in the middle, or in the bottom here, shows is the modern distribution, the expanding range of, I forgot my asterisks on the word occurrences below archaeological, then I don't know why I've been squished out of here. At Ventana Cave in Arizona, they tentatively identified Panthera onca and thought that they had it as well. So what it appears right now is that the range expansion, the modern recolonization of America by the jaguar, goes right back to where it was in the Pleistocene in 2 of the 3 occurrences, in Arizona, in that southern coastal portion of Texas, and now we're just missing it in Florida. So it's a very interesting kind of thing to see. So I guess I would stress in conclusion that the more things change, the more they stay the same, and that we're really seeing the waxing and waning of species and biotic communities at the same time that it's not just the mammals and large animals, it includes all of the small stuff and the plants that they depend on as part of their, as part of the trophic cascade they're involved in. And I'll say goodbye with one last thing, that on the note of the more things stay the same, that this month is the 105th anniversary of the first meeting of this kind in Florida, and this is a photograph provided by Elias Sellard's great-granddaughter of the family packing up to drive to Vero for the first symposium to talk about the plants and the animals, and Barry was there, who, and of course the archaeology. So thank you. Thanks.
Thank you, Andy. And unfortunately, we have run out of time, and if we want to stay on schedule, we're going to have to forego some questions. But I will say that during break, all of this discussion of Pleistocene fauna and megafauna has created really good vibes, because you can go out into the garden and see Priscilla, who has arrived.